Greetings. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Eric Lee. I am the Vice President of Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, ACWW, and I am pleased to welcome you to LiterASIAN 2020. Launched in 2013, LiterASIAN is an annual festival, actually the first of its kind in Canada, to promote and celebrate the works of Asian Canadian writers. This festival is a community building initiative of the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop with featured author readings, panel discussions, and workshop events. The COVID-19 pandemic has driven us to adapt and host this year's festival virtually, allowing us to deliver our events to you without restrictions. We are excited to embrace this year's global audience and invite you all to join our community. I'd now like to thank our partners and sponsors, Vancouver Manuscript Intensive, Canada Council for the Arts, BC Artscape, Pacific Canada Heritage Centre, PCHC, Iron Dog Books located in East Vancouver, Chinatown Youth Collaborative, Dark Helix Press, and of course, special thanks to our team of volunteers and our festival coordinator, Sophie Monk. Moving along, I'd like to introduce to you our moderator of today's event, writing and submitting to an anthology, Sylvia Leung. Sylvia recently graduated in English literature at the University of British Columbia. She is currently working in the federal government. She is experienced in technical, business, and policy writing, and is working on becoming a published fiction writer. Way to go, Sylvia. Take it away.
So it's a pleasure to be here today. I recognize that we've all logged onto this webinar from different territories, and I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from my home in Vancouver on the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I acknowledge all the nations who have cared for the land, recorded and unrecorded, and am grateful to have a home here. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. We have two editors who will offer their experiences and guidance on the inner workings of the often exclusive and opaque world of publishing. Let's have J.F. Gerard and Alan Cho share with us their insightful presentation.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be spending our day with you in today's presentation. And really, it's an opportunity for us to share with you our knowledge. I'm going to share my screen with everyone here. And here we go. Well, today's workshop is really about writing and submitting to a literary publication for BIPOC writers. But not just for BIPOC writers. I think today's presentation is also helpful for any writer that's thinking of submitting to a magazine or anthology. Agenda today, we're going to introduce a bit about ourselves and our experiences, J.F. Gerard and myself, about our experience as editors and writers as well. I want to talk a little bit about Ricepaper magazine because that's where we're from, and we have worked together for a number of years. We want to share with you a little bit more about the history of the magazine that we come from. And then we have top 10 considerations. Really, what are the top 10 things we want you to take away from today's workshop in deciding to publish and write for anthologies or magazines? They're separate things, but in many ways they share similar themes and challenges. And then, of course, we'll have time for wrap-up and questions. So plenty of chances for that. So if you have a pen or pencil and a piece of paper, you can start writing down not only notes that we're going to be talking about, but also questions that you might have as well. A little bit about myself. I've been an editor at Ricepaper magazine for close to 5 years now, and my professional career is as an academic librarian, and I've worked in academia and in publishing world for close to 13 years now. My day job isn't exciting for me enough, so I need to fulfill my passion during the night when I moonlight as for free as an editor at Ricepaper magazine. I volunteered for countless hours working on grants doing financial reports, picking up boxes of magazines from the printers to the office, and then driving them over to Canada Post for distribution. I've done it all. My real passion is really reading those submissions coming in, and seeing a lot of great writing with a lot of ambition, and of course a lot of writing that needs a lot of work, infused with a lot of ambition. And that's really what drives me to continue doing this, because there's a whole generation of writers that have a lot to say, and my job is really helping them along. And I've worked really closely with J.F. Gerard for a number of years now, so I pass the mic over to you.
Hi everyone, my name's J.F. Gerard. My full name actually is Jeannie Fong Gerard, but Gerard is my husband's last name. I thought I'd use the name because I'm a writer, and I thought it would be easier to submit to magazines because as a BIPOC writer, science fiction magazines, and I have an Asian last name. Although I've been told now that, you know, I should change my name back, but anyhow, I think it's too late. It's been a couple of years now. So I started as a writer, and I couldn't find a publisher for my book, which is an East meets West vampire book called The Undead Sorceress. So in the end, I did a Kickstarter. I opened up a company called Dark Helix Press in order to help other writers sort of get their voices out there. It's just really, really hard for writers to find a place for their writing in the publishing world. And a lot of times this really is business. I mean, you shouldn't take it personally sometimes when people reject you. It's very subjective, but at the same time, for a lot of the bigger presses, it's to make money, right? So it's nice to be able to help other people with my own press to publish other people. So I've been helping Ricepaper for a couple of years now as their deputy editor. I was doing some marketing for them before as well. It's a volunteer organization, so if anyone's interested in learning more about editing and writing, I mean, it's a good place to start to also help out in a place that needs, we always need like more manpower for all our different projects. I'm also the co-president of Canadian Authors Association in Toronto. So Canadian Authors Association is an organization that's geared towards helping writers or help themselves kind of thing. There's panels every month to teach writers how to write and how to publish, etc. So I recommend checking them out. I also do a little bit of editing for Amazing Stories magazine. So I'm their slush pile reader. So that's a science fiction magazine that was restarted recently. It's one of the oldest science fiction magazines in the world, I believe. So I've been in and out of publishing, but for this panel, I'll be talking as an editor. In a way, it's sort of hard to be an editor when you're a writer because, like, you write a lot, so then you want to see very different stories, but we'll get into that later. So anyhow, so that's my background. My education is actually in nuclear medicine and science, so I work in the healthcare industry because I have Asian parents. And anyhow, that's all I'm going to say, and maybe we should move on. So.
That's a wonderful introduction, Jeannie. More about Ricepaper magazine. You know, just like us, Ricepaper began, really the origins of it began in the 70s with the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop. And it was founded by, you know, the pioneers of Asian Canadian writing, if there's, if we can call it that, is really based on a group of people who had a lot to say. You know, just like what we're facing right now, a lot of anti-Asian racism. It was a world that was changing so quickly, and volunteers basically started the newsletter. Here's a picture of Paul Yee and Sky Lee in the middle, and with Jim Won Chu there with glasses, sitting together in their lawn. And really, they're pioneers. Of course, there's a number of people included as well of starting Ricepaper magazine. Paul Yee, for example, was an archivist working in the city of Vancouver. Jim Won Chu was a letter carrier at Canada Post, and Sky Lee was a nurse. They all had their day jobs, but they also had this real penchant for writing and using words to express themselves. And they had no idea what they were doing. They were just throwing words together. Jim really had this vision to start off a newsletter, and Ricepaper began in 1993 as really a grassroots literary newsletter, and it was hand stapled together like many zines that we see nowadays, and it was mailed across Canada to members, and was done very, very quickly and in the basements of their houses. So that's how really the origins of Ricepaper began, and then evolved to become a print magazine in which it was sold in bookstores and supermarkets, and over the years it's evolved to publish anthologies as well. And the first one was in the early 90s, Many-Mouthed Birds. And that we've continued that tradition with publishing, as you can see here in this, in your far left corner there, the page. We've continued publishing immersions, currents. Those are 2 anthologies, and then also 7 Muses of Harry Salcedo, published by us, and the author is Vincent Turnita. So we've continued this tradition, always evolving and using the technology that we have now, and doing it. So that's sort of how we've continued. We've moved online, so a lot of the great writing that comes in is published online. And we work on anthologies, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well. So in a snapshot, that's sort of where the context that we're coming from as editors. Jeannie, do you have anything to add to this?
Well, I guess we've started sort of a new tradition with so magazine, and now we're doing anthologies, which is a book format, which is something that was sort of done one-off before with LiterASIAN, with Arsenal Press, and then Currents, you guys did a Kickstarter. But I think now, because like I have this company anyways, might as well help out with the publishing. I mean, self-publishing is, oh God, it's a pain in the ass. Publishing is a pain in the ass. Why do we do this? I don't know. We do this to help, in order to, to get our ideas out there and to help writers and to sort of create change in the world. Otherwise, there's no point. But of course, we always need readers. So we have to do publishing to spread our word and to spread our messages about our community out there, really. So that's why we do this. Okay, so first slide, publishing anthologies or magazine, top 10 considerations surviving the slush file. So I think maybe we should talk. Well, we spoke a little bit about the difference between a literary magazine and anthology. I think first of all, I should say that this is all very subjective, because Alan and I are editors for Ricepaper magazine. So our opinion may differ from, like The Room or like another The Walrus, right? Because every magazine has their own sets of editors. So just because you submit to one magazine and you get rejected doesn't mean another magazine is going to reject you, right? Like, it's very subjective. Like myself, because I'm a writer, I submit to maybe 100 magazines and I might get maybe 2 replies. So that's like a 2%. And I might sell 1. So it's, it's very difficult. But it's something, you'll keep doing as a writer. But literary magazines, from a publishing perspective, they have a higher turnover. So they might have monthly editions, or they might have quarterly editions. An anthology is usually sort of one-off, right? It could be every few years, or sometimes it's just one. It depends on the publisher. And a slush pile is sort of like, it's everything. Everyone sends you stuff. So it has a bunch of stuff, and a slush pile editor's job is to go through everything and pick out the best in the pile. So, so Alan, does that sound right? Like what I'm saying?
Really good start, Jeannie. I'm going to talk a little bit about the understanding the market, and now sort of flush out a little bit of what Jeannie had mentioned earlier on. Really understand the market. There's really, if you sort of distill it down to what the landscape looks like, a literary landscape, there's really 3 types of literary magazines and 2 types of anthologies. And when we're talking about literary magazines, we're talking about, at the top, if you can sort of see a sort of pyramid, top tier literary journals, you know, your New Yorker, your Paris Review, Tin House magazine. We'll talk a little bit about Tin House in a bit. But you have your top tier magazines, which these are really, really hard to break into. You almost have to be very established to even have a shot at them. So those are, of course, the hardest to get in. And then the second sort of tier, you have the university journals. If you've heard of UBC's Prism magazine, for example, our local one here in Vancouver, Iowa Review, Brooklyn Review, they tend to accept established writers with a proven track record, but they also tend to accept emerging writers. Emerging writers meaning those that have a lot of promise, might or might not have a publication already under the belt. And then the third type is sort of this independent niche, sometimes online literary journals like Ricepaper magazine, but there are other ones like On Spec magazine, Room magazine, Geist, Joyland, Hazlitt. They tend to accept newer, less established writers, and they do make a leap of faith on a complete rookie who hasn't published anything. So I think that taking a look at those sort of three categories will give you a really good start, at least in terms of understanding where you're at. If you're a new writer, you might want to start with sort of like the niche independent literary journals. And then I mentioned anthologies. There's two kinds, because, you know, this workshop does talk about anthologies, of course, for us to consider. There are those that usually have call for submissions. We'll talk a little bit about call for submissions later on in our presentation and talk. We have one, in fact, right now, Ricepaper magazine. And then the second kind is those that recruit based on your reputation or previous submission. For example, Ricepaper's upcoming anthology project have a slew of submissions that have been accepted already on our webzine. We might pull from them and publish from those that are already, you know, in our magazine. So there's some anthologies that do that. So that if you can understand, there's two kinds of one is call for submissions, the other that is also one that is based on you know, an existing collection of articles that the editors want to work with already. So so that's sort of just helping us understand a little bit about the literary landscape. But I think my friend and mentor Jim Won Chu has always mentioned that what really, really matters is that prose can take you only so far. For a short story in particular, you really need a convincing plot line. The end must have an intention, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on in the upcoming sort of slides. But surviving the slush pile is really, does the world need another story told this way? So how do you stand out? Because there's a lot of articles usually submitted to a slush pile, and, you know, just looking at that picture that you see right now, how do you select one? How do you stand out from that? And I think that's something that we'll really, really want to help you out with, and particularly as a BIPOC writer, really challenging as well, because there are some expectations on you that you're not even aware of. So I'll move on to the next slide.
Okay, so on the second slide, we're talking just a little bit about the selection process. So usually you'll find out about, usually there's a call for submission from the magazine. You'll find out something like they usually tell you what kind of format they want you to send it in. There's a deadline, there's a theme. So depending on where you want to send your submission to, you'll have to do a little bit of research. And usually there's a mailbox that you send it into. And then you kind of wait for news. And sometimes it depends on the magazine. Sometimes you might not hear anything at all. So I'd say maybe after half a year, I think you can probably safely give up and send the story elsewhere. Some magazines don't let you send in simultaneous submissions, so you have to read carefully. There are some that say you can only send it to us, and they won't let you send it anywhere else. So those are the ones you can wait. Others say you can send it wherever you want, and then just let them know if you've sold the story. So did you want to explain a little bit about the Ricepaper submission, Alan, and then
Sure.
the other
Yeah,
stuff?
yeah. We use inbox in terms of accepting submissions. Some publications, for example, we use an online digital platform like Submittable, but you have to pay a fee to that, right? A submission fee. We decided to move away from that quite a few years ago because it was a hindrance, we felt, for some writers that didn't have the funds to do that, or became a barrier. So we moved to this sort of a simpler email system, and we would always have a theme. And then right now, we're having a rolling submission, so we'll accept submissions based on just timing. If there's a piece that comes in, we will consider it. And right now we don't have a theme set up because we're working very closely on with each other in terms of the upcoming anthology. So we don't sort of hem ourselves in, but that's how sort of Ricepaper has worked over the past number of years in doing that. I want to kind of go into this question about what excites editors, and maybe Jeannie, you can jump in. I have a few notes here in terms of what excites me as an editor when I receive a submission. Three things. I look at prose. How do the sentences come together? Sometimes right away it flows well, and then that kind of ties into the second thing, which is the selection of words. Particularly a poem. How are those choice of words? How do they flow together? And then third, sometimes people kind of miss out on this. The title. The title is really, really, for me, important. How does it stand out as well? Is it well thought out? So those are things that I look for. Those three things in terms of just looking at the very initially at the submission. For short stories, the first page is very important, but the first few paragraphs are extremely important for the short story. You don't have that much room to maneuver. So having those first few paragraphs, that first sentence, it has to be almost perfect, meaning that everything needs to flow together. It needs to have a really good theme set out. And then I also look at the query letter. We have a very simple submission form for writers to fill out, but really that's a query letter in a way. So you might see this differently with other literary magazines or anthologies, call for submissions. It can mean a difference between reading your first few pages or stopping and moving to the next submission in the pile. So don't submit without actually thinking through about the query. Take a course. There's some courses online about query. Read a blog. Ask for peer feedback. Anything that makes your query letter stand out is really important. And it's almost sometimes as important as manuscript. What do I mean by that? Having your biography, your full name, but of course if you have a pen name, you want to include that. Email, website, Twitter handle, anything that establishes you as a real writer and is serious in the submission. I think that's really important. It's an entire package. It's not just the written piece, but how you present yourself. I think that's how I look at submissions when I'm sort of doing my work as an editor. Jeannie, do you have anything to?
Because most of the time, by the time I get the piece, I don't see the query letter, so I don't really care about that part. But if you made it past Alan, then it'll come to me, I guess. But as a slush pile reader, for me, like a lot of times it's a lot of volume. Like I get a lot of stories and pieces. So I'm a skimmer. So I go through it really fast, and I can tell whether or not we like it or not. If it can't, like as Alan says, if I can't make it past the first page, well, I usually try to give it a chance. Maybe I read 3 pages, and then I'm like, yes or no. A lot of the times for me, it's dialogue for fiction, whether or not, like, there has to be a good balance between the dialogue and the exposition stuff. If there's too much of one or the other, then it's sort of off balance. Then it's sort of not a very balanced story, and it makes me lose interest. I sort of get bored quickly. With poetry, it's sort of the flow of the language and whether or not the idea is clear. Like, if the writer is trying to say something and I don't know what they're saying, and I'm really struggling with trying to understand the ideas behind a written piece, then I sort of have to stop. Because as well, right, as a slush pile person, you sort of understand that if you pick something that's not clean, as we call it, then the editor is going to have to spend a lot of time sort of cleaning up with the writer, trying to get those ideas really clear, and that means more time. And a lot of times, depending on the magazine or anthology board, like, there's not that much time for the editors to work, right? If there's a deadline, especially. So you want something that's clear and concise. Like, are there too many words that are unnecessary? Are there any, like, plot devices that you don't even need that's there, right? Like, everything has to be tight, I guess is what I'm saying. For short stories, beginning, middle, end. I mean, the end can be ambiguous, but you sort of have to lay out the land very quickly. It's not a novel, because for a novel, you have 30 chapters. But for a short story, you have, like, what, 2,000, 10,000 words? So you have to be very clear what you want to say and what's happening. But generally, what excites me about a submission, like I said before, actually, in a way, having a writer also be an editor is kind of horrible, because we've thought about a lot of ideas already. So you have to try really hard to send me something that I haven't seen or thought of. But generally, it depends on the theme or the idea that that magazine or anthology wants to convey, right, for that project. So every project is different. So if your piece comes in, it has a very interesting idea, you wrote it well, and the ideas come clear, then definitely it's a high chance we'll pick it. Automatic rejections, I mean, that's kind of like, you know, a lot of sex for no reason, really horrible sex, extreme violence, you know, racist stuff, you know, sort of things like that, that are going against a lot of ideas that we stand for, we will not accept, right?
Thanks, Jamie. We'll touch on more on that, because you mentioned really some key pieces there that I want to talk about as well. And next one, common mistakes.
So, well, one common mistake is if there's a theme and the writer just ignores it. They just send in whatever they have left over. You can tell, like, you know, we asked you to write, I don't know, let's say about a feather, and then, you know, you get all these pieces about balls. Like, it's really obvious that you didn't read what we put on the submission page. Then that's sort of an automatic rejection, unless it's really, really good, and then we'll think about maybe putting in another issue or something like that. But the guidelines are there for a reason. I mean, I'm not that picky about formatting, honestly, but I know there are some other editors that are, that if you don't follow the formatting guidelines, that's an automatic rejection. So that's subjective as well. Writing rules or stuff like, you know, the grammar, spelling mistakes, etc. I'm actually not that picky about it, because I figure if you have a really good story and the ideas come through, I think as an editor, I can help you clean up over time. But again, it depends on other editors too, right? If there's other people involved, they might not like you because of spelling mistakes or grammar rules, etc. So, Alan?
Yeah. You mentioned two things I wanted to mention, so it's great. Follow submission guidelines. Really important. You might be submitting to something that's entirely not what the editors are looking for. So, be very clear that you know what you're going into. Of course, and then of course, spelling grammatical errors is really important as well. Not only in the piece, but also in your introduction to yourself. I mentioned the so-called query. I want to go back to that. Sending in a submission electronically without a subject. So you're basically sending in something that blank topic. Not good. Not good for call for submissions. I've had some of that in our previous submissions to a call for submissions. Here's our anthology that I talked about earlier on that Ricepaper produced and published by Asian Canadian Writers Workshop versions. We, every now and then we've had people submit without really having even the going through the submission process, meaning that query letter, the introduction, the bio, a little bit of a synopsis of what the story is. None of that with a blank subject. So right off the bat, that's going to hurt you. So we definitely don't want that. Another thing I want to talk about is the storyline and the description. Jeannie touched on a little bit about that, sort of like what to look out for. One old pitfall that I think that you need to be careful of, and I've come across enough submissions that I can confidently say to be careful about this, is the use of the flashback. Do not use a flashback at the beginning of your story. What I mean by that is that if the flashback is interesting enough, then that should be your story right there. So it should be chronologically done that way. It's really, really easy to fall back to that because it's used a lot in novels and longer pieces of writing where you can jump around in timelines and be a little bit creative. In a very short 4,000 to 10,000 word piece submission, short story, you got to be very, very careful in terms of how you use the flashback. So not a lot of people mention that in terms of the workshops that I've gone into and sort of talking about that as something, but I really find personally the flashback is a real challenge. I tried to use it in my own writing, and it's very hard to pull off. But if you're trying to do this, make sure that you really know your story before going into it. Flashback is easy to use as something to fall back on because it's just easy to do, and you see it a lot in movies and things like that as well. So anyways, that's one thing I would be careful and recommend you thinking more about. Second one is description. Too much description is a problem. You probably have heard about this, do rather than describe, and a lot of times that could, having some dialogue might help. But I want to talk about turning, about description. You don't want to turn your story into a screenplay. I think whenever you do an edit of your own writing, pay close attention to whether it sounds like it's turning into a screenplay where you're describing everything. So don't be too descriptive. You need dialogue and storyline to be moving forward all the time. If it stalls, it's usually because you're describing something, and it's really slowing it down. And I find that when I read submissions, there's a really good storyline right off the bat, moving really quickly, and then it kind of stalls. A description about the characters. There's overthinking almost in terms of where the plot is going. So it kind of stalls, and then that loses my attention, and I find it really, really hard to get to the end. So it has to be a nice balance and a nice flow throughout it as well. So those are just a couple of things that I like to sort of throw out there as well, the flashback and the description.
I want to add to that also a point of view. Like sometimes usually people will pick, like when you write the story, it's usually one person's perspective, but then when you throw in other people's views, it sort of gets confusing. Like you're telling a story about a kid, and you know the kid's thoughts, and then suddenly it switches to the mom and how she thinks. So it's sort of confusing how who's telling the story, right? So you have to think about a little bit about context about who your main character is and how you're presenting it in first person and third person, etc. Like how you're going to write the piece. So
great.
Okay.
Moving on. Editor-writer
relationship. Okay. So when does an editor start working with a writer? So you've survived the slush pile, we're presuming at this point. because you're going to meet the editor. So the slush pile editor is, the first pass guy, and then they'll take your piece and send it to the editor. And at that point, depending on the process of the magazine or anthology, you'll receive a congratulatory email letter and sometimes a contract. It depends on what the magazine pays or doesn't pay, etc. And then it's your decision whether or not you sign on to continue on the relationship or your submission. So let's say you're like, okay, I've submitted a piece to Ricepaper, they like it, and I'll continue. So then you'll be introduced to an editor you'll work with, sometimes more than one editor. And basically what happens is they will tear your piece apart. It's not that scary. Well, it is scary, but I mean, basically you'll get a document. Usually we work in Word with track changes of all the things the editor thinks is wrong with the piece. I think at this point as a writer, you have to calm yourself down, keep your ego in check, because an editor's job is really to help the writer. Like, they didn't take the time to put all those red marks because, they think it's fun. It's because they think by doing that, it'll clear up your ideas so the readers have an easier time understanding your story. So just depending on how clean your piece is, it could be a lot of red marks or very few red marks. But overall, the editor is the main person that will help you make your story better. You're still the superstar as a writer, and the editor is sort of your producer, okay? They're helping you with your writing. And yeah, I've only had a few instances where I presented edits and the writers refused to do it. So at that point, I was working with another editor, and we're like, well, I guess we can't continue because at this point, we don't feel their piece is up to par. It doesn't meet the standards of our magazine. So then we just say, well, it's really nice you think your piece is perfect, but we want you to modify a few things. Because the editor is going to look at a whole bunch of stuff. So they also want to make sure everything is, it's not standardized, but there's a style, right? So that everything is sort of, it fits into the anthology or magazine. And so if a writer refuses to work with the editor, then at that point, I think the relationship ends. So that's my 2 cents, Alan.
Really good points, Janie. I want to talk about the formal relationship, a little bit about what Janie talked about, building on that. And now I'll mention a little bit about the informal relationship because I think that's something that's also important as well. I think personally, it's the relationship between writer and editor. Formally speaking, is built on respect and trust. There has to be some sort of trust that the writer has with the editor. The writer, has to trust the editor's fresh eyes and insight. There's a reason why there's a request for this to be changed, the style to be modified a little bit. I personally had mixed experiences with editors. I had a truly brilliant one who I really trusted and really changed the way I thought about the piece. And then I've also worked with an editor that really basically did nothing and just sort of accepted the story as is. So it's that the relationship is really interesting, and it's different with each submission that you have. One thing I want to mention is that this kind of touches on sort of being a minority writer, as BIPOC writer, from historically marginalized communities, where it's really hard to find an editor that truly understands you're writing something. You almost feel like that. And I think part of this is I've been doing some thinking about Asian Canadian writers and the relationship with editors. And a lot of editors are not, in terms of Asian Canadian writers and the relationship, they're not Asian Canadian. They're not BIPOC themselves, and that's a challenge in terms of breaking in. I believe there's no shortage of Asian Canadian writers. There's I think we've come to a stage where we can almost say that there's a plentiful group of writers out there, and still there's a whole new generation that's emerging. I think in the past, when Ricepaper started, before my time, when Jim Monchu was working on it, had a real challenge of finding writers. So, and I'll talk a little bit about this a little later on, because I think there's a slide that will mention this, that he had to actually go out there and search for writers that are from historically marginalized backgrounds, and he had to really pursue them and encourage them to write. Now it's kind of the opposite. We have a lot of writers, I believe, that are submitting it out there. And if you're watching this this webinar that we're giving, you're probably somebody that's interested, and you probably have a story that you're working on. I find that there needs to be also a generation of Asian Canadian editors that need to evolve as well, because there isn't that real understanding of how we can shape your writing or help you along. So that's a real challenge. And this sort of touches on the informal relationship. I think I mentioned Jim Monchu's editor. He did a lot of times informally, and now Marlene, his wife, is kind of doing it informally as well. People would send them manuscripts, and they would look it over, and they would offer really not general, but really critical feedback, and they would do it out of the goodness of their hearts. You know, they're not paid to do it, but they're doing it as consultants. We're kind of missing that, I think, in terms of the landscape now, the literary landscape. I think Jeannie and I are trying to do that through Ricepaper, and that's why we're doing this anthology project, and these anthology projects coming up is because we want to help writers get published, but also to better understand their writing. And I think we're missing this. And I've been looking into editing certificates and more professional training programs in Canada, at least. I don't want to go into the States because I'm not as familiar. And the instructors are, for most part, mainstream. It's still very, very dominant. It's a very dominant group of, really white editors. And where are Asian Canadian editors? There are far and few between. So this is that informal relationship, meaning that people that you can turn to in terms of editing, or people that you can pay, you can hire to be your editor and sort of reviewing a manuscript. If you look at the Editors Association of Canada, there aren't that many that are from BIPOC backgrounds, and I think that's a really, really important gap that has not been addressed yet. And I'm hoping that today's workshop, at least, would get the conversation started.
Yeah, I mean, to add to that, like BIPOC editors, I mean, let's be honest, there's not many publications or anthologies that are, BIPOC. So unfortunately, like I've been hearing that for some that really want to be a writer and succeed, they've had to, I don't know, say tone down or generalize their writing, you know what I mean, to make it more accessible to a general audience. So in a way, it's almost like cleansing, you know what I mean? It's sort of like making it so general that it's accessible to all audiences, but at the same time, you're not putting in differentiative stuff so that it's obvious it's a BIPOC person, you know what I mean? Like, it's like a business, unfortunately, for the bigger publishing houses and stuff, it's a business, so they want it to be as general as possible. But with small independent presses, I think they're the ones that take more risks. So if you're looking for a place to send more diverse writing, I start with the smaller publications. I think they're more willing, they're more open, and they're more willing to take a risk on new writers as well. So,
really good point, Jeannie. Before I move to the next slide, really the publishers are the gatekeepers in sort of the literary culture, in particularly in Canada. And I think that editors are a really important sort of conduit between the two. But I think that's in itself something that we want to touch on a little bit later on as well, is that without having a relationship of writers that understand the writing and really encourage you to pursue it. That's another sort of level of gatekeeping as well that can be a problem if you're sort of looking at it in sort of one direction.
How to handle rejection. So, yeah, I have a group of writer friends. We always talk about this. So it is very common for a writer to get rejected. It's just something you have to live with. But depending on the magazine or anthology, sometimes it's okay actually to ask for feedback. You can try. I mean, all you can do is ask, was there something that you didn't like about my piece? Is there anything I can improve? Because usually when you get a rejection letter, it's really like one or two sentences, like, oh, it doesn't fit our criteria, or like, good luck placing it elsewhere. Usually, I think that's pretty common. So it doesn't really tell you anything about why were you rejected in the first place. So it's okay to ask, and depending on the person, they'll write you a letter. I mean, I've written long letters to people, and then one writer thanked me because they said it's not usual. I was like, yeah, well, I had time, so I thought I'd give you some feedback. In regards to social media rants, I mean, social media is rampant everywhere, but I think it's sort of like burning a bridge. Like, unless you don't ever want to submit to that magazine again, yeah, sure, go on a rant. But if you want to submit to them again, then I'd say hold on to your anger and sort of try better next time, right? Like, it's like playing a game. You can try scoring another time. Like, it's okay. So I think, and unfortunately, a lot of times, social media, the stuff stays there. I mean, even when you take it down. So I'm just saying, just be a little cautious, right? Because your reputation's on the line too. So.
Mm-hmm. How to handle the rejection? Submissions can be rejected for all sorts of reasons. We mentioned some of those just based on our own personal experiences. There are a number of them. I think a good example is even Madeleine Tien, Giller Prize winner, had many rejections of her first manuscript when she was out of creative writing, and she submitted simple recipes to a number of places. And was rejected until it was finally accepted by Douglas and McIntyre. And the rejection letters still sit in the archives at the library at UBC, because Jim Monchu kept some of that in his archives there. That's a good example. Like, even if a Giller Prize winner got rejected, it means that everyone should not be afraid to be rejected. One of the things I find working as an academic librarian is I work a lot with university professors. I find this really interesting analogy, and it's really a good example of persistence. Tenure professors are basically academic writers who are very persistent because they need to do it in order to keep their jobs. This thing that you call publish or perish. I think that's a really good ethic to think about in terms of being a writer and how hard it is. I think tenure is often about producing that one book project, and a lot of times it depends only on one book to get you over the hump, to get the so-called tenure, that ongoing job. It takes forever, but still at the end of the day it gets done. So you hear this a lot in the news, how academics would work on all sorts of odd jobs and endure hardship and part-time teaching jobs as sessionals for almost minimum wage. Yet they do it because they love it, right? I think only top 10% of those PhDs, or I shouldn't say top, this lucky 10% of PhDs go on to land tenure-track jobs, whereas the rest would sort of continue, teaching part-time and just doing all sorts of jobs on the sides in order to continue their passion, which is research and writing. So academia is full of starving artists, and that's the mentality you have to take on and be ready for if you want to make it as a writer. And so I hear a lot of writers say, "Oh, it's really hard to handle all these rejections. There's only so many rejections I could take." But if you think about it, there are a lot of people in academia that are never going to get rich, but they never expect to be, because they're already at peace with the reality that the writing itself is really the what brings a lot of happiness. And they might not, be a full-time writer, meaning a tenured professor, and that's okay, because yes, there is, at the end of the day, some real challenges with it, but they can do other things to pursue their passion. We'll have this in the next upcoming few slides as well, talking about that. So I want to put that into in terms of rejection, is that it's difficult, but there are strategies to help you along the way, both psychologically and mentally as well. Jeannie, do you have anything to add?
No, I think we should move on.
Okay, let's move on. How to stand out.
So when it comes to creating art, it always helps to stand out from the pack. So we have a picture here of goldfishes, and there's one fish that's a different color. So like I said, for slush file editor, just pick your story. Like, they see a lot of stories, so there has to be something special about it. I can't really tell you what it is. I don't think anyone knows the secret, but it's sort of like, it's like a je ne sais quoi. When they see it, they know, right? Like, it's special. I think it's something, if you're more experienced, right, you've done it so many times, it's just you've practiced, so you know what works and what doesn't. So you sort of, and after many rejections, I guess, you sort of understand what people like, what people don't like, and then eventually you figure out a formula that suits yourself as a writer, what you think will work. Some overused story and plots. I mean, there's only so many plots in the world. I think when you look up on Google, I think there's like 10, 12 plot lines, but it's just how you tell the story that's different. The people in it, making the characters come alive. So that's really your technique, your writing technique, right? Like, when people read your writing, they're forming a picture in their mind. So when you can pass on your ideas clearly, then you've succeeded. Do you want to touch base a bit more on this, Helen?
Yeah, the plot lines I won't touch too much on. You're absolutely right. I mean, if you can do a quick search and do your research, and yes, it comes down to some common ones. But what you really want, in my opinion, as an editor, is you want a coherent story that stands out. And what does that mean? Well, it means that you have to have the end in mind. I read a lot of short stories in which it kind of goes nowhere. Like, it begins with a lot of promise. I mentioned this early on. It begins with a lot of promise, and it kind of just trails off and sort of fizzles out. One of the tricks that I've found is that to write a 2-sentence description of what your story will be about with the end in mind. So if you can have the story with the end already, then your 4,000 to 10,000 piece writing will be so much easier. You have it all mapped out. And what that really, but it's not just the story in mind. Yeah, you want to have a twist perhaps at the end that will surprise people and really nail home the effect of the story, the aftertaste. But what I think is important in helping you leading up to that is what I look out for is the protagonist and what his or her desires are. If you know the protagonist right off the bat, that is equally important as knowing the end of the story, what you want. And it doesn't matter if it's a short story, a poem, or screenplay, or even nonfiction. Having a protagonist, the star of the story, is really important. So you need to very clearly even before you put your pen to paper, knowing what the protagonist is, and then what the story is. And then you also want to know the antagonist of the story as well. It might not be a person. It could be a situation. What is the antagonist? And then I think what I really look for is at the end of the story or the piece that you're writing for is what's at stake for the world at large. So what's the larger picture of the story? So if you can have that also mapped out before you actually do the writing, that will ultimately push you to stand out from the rest of the slush pile, because you already have a really clear thesis to your piece. I would look for those things in terms of how to stand out. And I mentioned earlier on a little bit about your query as well. I think your profile needs to stand out as a writer. We'll talk a little bit about that, but of course you want to include your bio. You also want to give some evidence that you have writing credentials, meaning that if you've been published in the past, you want to mention that. That's if you're part of any writing societies, like if you're a member of the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, for example, you want to put that in your bio as well. So you want to build some credibility and begin a track record. And as you submit, you want to stand out not just in the storyline and the writing that you submit, but also in the whole package as well. So.
And I'm presuming most of you guys took high school English, right? All those things you learn in English about, the conflict and the resolution and stuff like that. It's all true. It still stands to make a strong story. I mean, that's sort of the basic structure that we were taught back in English class. It still works. Very old ideas that are still true today. And I think short stories in a way have sort of evolved over time. I think before the style was, in a way, not much happens in the beginning, but I think now there's tendency to be more action shown first, and there's conflict and stuff like that. I think over time, the writing's evolved. It's a bit different than, like, how you say it, more action-packed. So anyhow. But what Alan was talking about before about standing out, so we wanted to touch base about creating a writer's profile, right? This is like whenever someone hears your name, they're going to look you up on the internet. So a lot of people have a writer's platform or a website. It's almost like their resume, right? To let people know that, oh, I'm a writer, I published here. And it's helpful for the publisher and editors to sort of look at what you've published in the past to sort of see your style. So that also goes along with their behavior, right? Like, are they part of, like, how serious are they? Like, are they serious enough to join a writing organization? Or are they serious enough to volunteer somewhere? That this is someone that is serious about the craft, and their writing, is probably pretty good, right? You assume so from their resume, sort of thing. So.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned this earlier on, but really having shown that you have a track record. So if you don't have one, you want to start building one. It could be something that you volunteered writing for in a local newspaper or a journal, anything. But having that short story published in a literary journal or an anthology can really tip the odds in your favor. It'll put you above 95% of the other slush pile authors as well. Believe it or not, there are a lot of people that don't have anything published. So having something under your belt would just go a long way. Jeannie mentioned earlier on, you will be Googled. So on more than one occasion, I've spoken with other editors who have opted out to not work with a particular writer because the person was either unkind on their public social media pages or in the query itself. And the reason why is because no one likes to work with unkind people, especially the editor and writer relationship is a very unique one. It can last a long time, in terms of the publication, or if it's an anthology, it could last longer than a year. So, hey, literary agents are even more harder to please. So be nice on social media. I believe it's really important. It's part of your whole profile. You want to be controversial, of course. You're an artist. You have things you want to say, but at the same time, you want to be very careful in terms of how you're narrating your profile. I think that's really important in sort of our social media age. So I'll leave it at that.
And yeah, just showing that if you have been published, then it sort of means that we know you have the experience. So you sort of know a little bit what to expect, like when we decide to work with you, that sort of thing, right? So it makes it easier for your future editor as well. So, okay, I think we've touched enough on this.
Yeah.
So one thing we cannot emphasize enough is practice, practice, practice. So an editor's job is to make the writer's ideas come forward and be clearer, but it's also up to the writer themselves to come up with the original ideas, right? So there are many ways to practice. There's writing classes, there's clubs you can join, there's also conferences you can attend. And not everything is free. So I know, like, you know, being a writer, sometimes you don't get paid much or at all sometimes, right? But there are certain things you can do that are free. There's a lot of online stuff because of COVID now. So I do encourage you to look for other opportunities. Like LiterASIAN is one of them. Like, everything has been free. But there's other stuff that's being offered right now that you can do. But you have to sort of set the time aside to do it. Like, it's really hard, especially when you're working full time or if you have a kid and other things. You have to be very protective of your own time to protect that time for writing. Otherwise, it just disappears. It's honestly easier to watch Netflix than to, like, write, right? So you have to invest in yourself, and it's a long-term game. Like, it's not a short-term game. Like, it's going to be a while before success comes. There are very few overnight success stories. So just, you know, keep trying, and eventually one day success will come. And my husband keeps telling me, count your successes, don't count your failures, because there's going to be a lot of rejections, right? So it's important that you remain optimistic and just keep practicing.
Really good point, Jeannie. I'm going to touch very quickly on this guy, Wei-Sin Choi. Jade Peony is a really good inspiration in terms of I really like your key term there, overnight success. Wei-Sin Choi, though he is a literary icon, not just in Canada, but just throughout the world in terms of as a writer and author, but he was not an overnight success. It took him close to 30 years to get discovered. His first book, Jade Peony, was based on a short story that I had written 30 years ago in the 60s in Korean writing school at UBC. And it was discovered by Jim Won Chu, who was looking at, he was doing his research, and he was trying to come up with a list of Asian Canadian writers. And Jade Peony came up in terms of his search of literary journals. There weren't many Asian writers, and he convinced Wei-Sin to make a pitch. And Jade Peony was one of three stories, and it was the weakest one that Wei-Sin thought. But he had all these stories that he had to choose from, and he just sort of had that as his third favorite one. And that was the one that Douglas McIntyre had selected for telling him to build on it and let's get a novel of it. So I think, in short, is that you want to have you want to practice, but at the same time you want to have some stories that you're able to put in your back pocket. And I'm told that that 12 is actually a really good start. If you can get 12, that's one per month. If you can have one story over the next year per month, have that as part of your collection of stories in your own personal anthology. That's a really good way to get to the finish line in terms of not only practicing, but having it ready for submission to anthologies and magazines. So easier said than done, but it doesn't come overnight. And even the most fascinating successes really is based on that one short story.
Sorry, I'm just answering a question. How do you research which magazines to submit? I'm just typing an answer that, you know, you can Google for
Absolutely.
submission lists, and there's other websites, specific websites.
Yeah.
Okay. Michael's asking, early on you put journals in tiers or ranks, and New Yorker is at the top. Where do journals like PANK, Hobart, or the colleges belong on the ranking, and they're independent? Oh boy, okay.
We can talk about some of this. Yeah, these are great questions. Keep them coming on. We're just going to finish off our slides here. We have a few more things to say, and then we can dive right into the questions here. Next one is anything else. Considering everything we have discussed, automatic rejections, common problems, what else should be part of the decision-making process when we're in the submissions process?
Well, I think for me, at the end of the day, it has to be a really good story that, you know, exciting, and I'm willing to forgive a lot of things if it's a good story. Like for me, I think I look at the more broader picture. and then see how clean it is. I mean, if it's a lot of work to clean up, I mean, sometimes we just reject it because we just don't have the time. Like if you're looking at Anthology with like 40 pieces and you have a couple of months, like I don't have the time to sit down and work with someone. It depends on the project. I mean, I've one where one writer, I think I worked with her for 8 months for one story, and it was about, what, 15,000 words? That took a long time, but I thought it was a pretty good story. And I had the time, and the project didn't really have a deadline. So it depends on the project, depends on the editor. A lot of it's subjective, like I said. Depends on where you're submitting, right? Like the higher ranking magazines Alan mentioned, they're going to be a lot stricter on submission guidelines, a lot stricter on how good you are, because there's just so much competition, right? You have to make sure what you're sending in is the best of the best, right? So you also have to do your work, deciding on where to submit. Like you have to do your homework. Like there's so many submission opportunities out there, but it's like it takes a lot of time to also submit. I mean, getting together that query letter, making sure it's formatted the same way, because not every magazine is going to ask for the same formatting. You might change the formatting even if you're submitting to the same story to different magazines. So I think the writer also has to decide where they want to send their stuff and then see how it goes, right?
Great. I would say what really important thing is track your submission. Sort of builds on what Jeannie was talking about, is you got to do the work, but doing the work means very simply, you use an Excel and catalog the story name, the publication, the website. Where did you actually submit your stories or poems to? And then make sure that you have a category that says open, rejected, or accepted. Particularly if you're playing the numbers game and you want to submit it to as many places as possible, make sure that you keep track of where you're submitting to, and make sure you don't submit it twice. Make sure that that you don't submit to the same magazine again with another story, or you're submitting the same story to 2 or 3 places. So just having a very, very clean and organized way of tracking your submissions will come very handily to you, because it will help you also work with editors in terms of editing your piece and just knowing where everything belongs, because it can be very confusing. A lot of times you will hear back 3 or 4 months afterwards, and if you don't have it kept track of very well structured, you could be having some issues down the road as well.
So our closing remarks, I guess, at this point, if there's one piece of advice an editor give to people today who have had a lot of success getting out of the slush pile, what would it be? For me, I think as a writer, I say practice, practice, practice. I think it's a lot of it. It's not. I don't think it's rocket science, but it's really you communicating your ideas out there to somebody. Because I write a lot of fantasy stuff. A lot of it is world building. If you can convey the world in your head to other people clearly, I think you have a high chance of getting out of the slush pile. That your ideas are clear, concise, and it goes with whatever theme that magazine wanted. I think you have a high chance of success. So for me, it's practice, practice, practice. Okay.
That's a really good point. I'll end off this very quickly before we get to our audience's questions, because I know there's questions waiting to be answered. I would recommend really thinking hard. Ask yourself, do you want to be a writer or do you want to be an author? I think at the end of the day, there's nothing stopping you from being a writer. The only ones stopping you from being a writer is yourself. Writing can be fun. It can be a hobby. The difference between an author and a writer is that an author is one that gets published, that's continually working and honing on the craft. Sort of the saying that writer writes words, but an author builds worlds. There's a lot more work involved in becoming a published author. Even for literary journals, it takes a lot of work to get one piece published in a literary journal or magazine. So that's a difference. You can have fun, and that's totally fine. But if you want to be an author, it takes work and it takes dedication. We talked about editing. You might need to work with a writing group or hire an author or hiring an editor to hone your craft and give you some really good feedback as well. So that's a difference. You can have fun, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Okay, so thanks so much for today's presentation. It was so insightful and informative. So now it's questions and answers time. So you have a question, jot them down through Q&A. So let's go on to the question that we first have with Michael. So early on, you put journals in tiers or ranks, the New Yorker being at the top. Where do journals like Pank, Harvard, or the colleges belong in the ranking ladder? They are independent publications and used to publish writers early in their careers that have made a name, like Roxane Gay and Brian Washington. How do you rank these journals?
You wanted me to touch on that?
Yeah, you talk
Sure.
about
Yeah, I talked a little about this. Those categories are based on personal research and some bias as well. So when I put the Tin House, and which is, by the way, is no longer publishing its literary journal, it's gone into book publishing and podcasts and things like that, and workshops, and also New Yorker and Paris Review. Yeah, those are established. We know that the most established writers tend to have a better shot at those ones. And then you have those the other literary journals. Not to say that those literary journals are not top tier. Definitely, there is a gray area in terms of moving up from one category to another. But for the most part, the literary journals from universities tend to sort of fall into that, between that the second category and the first category, top tier. And can it change over time? I don't know. But this is just based on personal experiences that the literary presses from the universities are well funded. They have editors that tend to be faculty or grad students from the Masters of Fine Arts programs. So they're very, very well funded, and they have attract a lot of great submissions for it. Great way to get started. It's not any way to downplay those particular journals. Prism magazine, locally here in Vancouver, has published a number of writers over the years that have gone on to do a number of great things. It's a really good place to get started for both established and emerging writers as well. So there's no easy answer to that question. In terms of categories, you can do your research and you'll find similar categories that breaks it down according to sort of prestige levels as well.
Sometimes it also depends on the organization, like for the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. So in order to join this organization, you have to have published in certain rankings, right, of publications. So they list out their criteria, like it has to be a pay rate that's a professional, and they have certain magazines that they consider as higher ranking than others. So it depends on that organization and how they rank it, and then after you publish a certain amount, then they're willing to let you in as a professional author and list you on their website, etc. So it depends on what organization you want to be part of too, because some of them won't let you join unless you publish through certain magazines or anthologies or etc. So it depends what you want to do. I mean, I don't think the ranking is, I mean, in a way the ranking isn't that important. I mean, for your personal use, I mean, you will know. A lot of times, like some of the other websites, or like Rowland.com, that I had answered another question, they talk about pro market rates, they talk about amateur rates, and so obviously the more professional writers are going to be paid more. So it just depends on how much they're being paid per word. But sort of like, I mean, obviously the more famous you are, then you'll move up in the journals eventually. Like, I don't think it's something you have to worry about now. I think just do your best, write, and just get published, and see how it goes. And then eventually, over time, in the long run, you'll make your way up to the higher ranking journals. And
I want to touch on the rankings. It's also really important to remember in terms of their genre as well. For example, if you're interested in science and speculative fiction as an area that you want to really build a name and career in, writing career in, then a magazine like On Spec might be the best fit. And in terms of science fiction, Jeannie, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's considered fairly well established On Spec in terms of Canadian speculative and science fiction literary journals.
Well, yeah, now that you sort of open it up to in the Canadian market, but then internationally, I'd probably Asimov or Science Fantasy magazine, right? So the Canadian market is quite small. So, you know, not that I'm saying anything bad, but like, you know what I mean? Like, it depends on what your goal is. So.
So, Asimov is a really good example of that, is that it would not necessarily be a ranked literary, you know, sort of top tier, but that's not what this category is about. So what I should preface when I sort of establish sort of those different tier ranking, it's literary, so it's not genre specific. So I think that will help sort of clarify things as well.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks for the clarification. So I have a question here. So let's just say I submit something and maybe I did a bad job my first time and it just landed on the slush pile. But then later on for the next call of submission, I submit something again. And would you give me a chance if you recognize my name, or would you have a bad impression of me or anything, or do you just don't even remember me?
I don't think I remember. No, actually, like, it depends, right? If your writing was really good, well, okay, you mean like you were rejected the first time and then you sent in something the second time?
Yeah.
I think it depends, right? Like, if you have a very distinct writing style, I think the second time, we would recognize you, and then we'll see, you know, do you fit or not, right? Like, it depends on why you were rejected the first time too, right? It's all, like I said, it's really subjective. It's just, it's a game. Oh my goodness. So it depends on the person. And I might not be the slush pile reader the second time. So you don't know, right? When you submit sometimes, who's the slush pile reader? It might be a totally different person. So I think if just because you're rejected the first time, I think you could send in something a second time. Just don't send in the same thing. If you send in something different, I think you'll get a fair chance, honestly. So.
Really good point. I would say check the submission guidelines. I mentioned that earlier on. There are specific guidelines for different journals and literary magazines, and read it. Sometimes there are specific requests that you do not submit the same story twice, or there's like sort of embargo period where, you know, if you're already been accepted, don't send it in again for the remainder of the year, or something like that. So every publication is different. It varies. So also pay attention to that as well. Great question.
Thanks. So now that during COVID-19 and everything, so I guess the question would be, do real world events such as these things affect the submission process? Or has this submission process been kind of similar throughout the years, no matter what has happened in the real world? You know what I mean?
Well, I think because we work sort of online, I don't think it's made much of a difference, because I'm in Toronto and Alan's in Vancouver, so we've always worked online. I don't think it's made much of a difference to us, and we still call each other and stuff. So I don't think COVID has really affected us that much.
It's been fortunate for our literary publication because we kind of do it as a passion project, and we rely on sources of income from other places. I've seen and heard that it's been challenging for artists, both visual and literary, and the submissions have been coming in on a steady basis. Hasn't really changed, but I've heard from friends who are artists that it's been really a difficult period because the work that they get either commissioned for or usually expect pay from their artistic sources have dwindled. So I think that's hurt I think in the longer run, we don't know how much longer things will be as is and standstill. It will hurt artists. So I really feel badly for writers who want to do their craft, but at the same time, they have to worry about their next paycheck as well. So it's the broader implications beyond just the Ricepaper that I'm just sort of thinking out loud here. But we've been fortunate in terms of still continuing as is.
Yeah, I've heard from people that are women writers that because of the childcare situation, it's taken a toll. I mean, as a writer, yes, it's taken a toll because of having noisy child around. But anyhow, what can you do, right? So I think over time we'll see. I mean, I think that's COVID broadly. I mean, we might be going into a recession, etc. So I think that'll affect a lot of things.
So as you both are both writers and editors, how does one practice affect your other practice? So how does being an editor also help you as a writer or change your perspective, etc.?
I honestly never expected to be an editor. But when the opportunity presented itself, I said, okay, I'll give it a shot. And I think I've learned, like, from reading other people's writing, you sort of catch things, and then you sort of apply the lessons to your own. Because, when you work with other editors, you sort of see what they like and, what to watch out for, some pitfalls. But I mean, no, it's very, like, writing's not perfect. I mean, it's an art that I think you have to work on continuously. And then, you see, it's kind of, I feel really bad sending rejection letters to writers because as a writer myself, it's just horrible to see. But at the same time, you sort of, as from the editor's perspective, it's just, there's too much stuff out there and you can't publish everything, unfortunately, right? So I think being an editor, you sort of learn about the business side more, right? And how to process things. And as a writer, you're sort of like, doing more creative stuff, right, and doing whatever you want. So it's a little bit different. But Alan, you write more literary, like you write for journals more, though, right? You're not.
Yeah, I do that in my sort of day job, professional work in terms of the academic world. I do a lot of that sort of the research side of things, and I have through that I've also edited academic journals and monographs as well. So I understand the business much better, I think, from terms of the big business side of things. I know sort of on both sides as a struggling artist, what they go through, but at the same time, big business, how much money and monopoly they have as well. So I can see it from both sides. As an editor, it's given me a lot more perspective and respect and understanding of where writers are coming from, and how hard it is to be submitting something. You're giving a lot of yourself in your piece, and it's really quite vulnerable. And as an editor, you just sort of slash and burn, and you cut pieces that you think shouldn't belong there, and say, oh yeah, I think we can only have 25 pieces. This 26th one article here is really, really good. This poem here really is good, but we just can't fit it in there. That's what an editor does. They have to make those really hard decisions, and a lot of times it's arbitrary and it's subjective. I have a lot of respect for writers because they have no idea what's going on in the background. They can only judge based on acceptance or rejection, and they sort of base their success on acceptance and rejection. This binary world, and as an editor, it's not so straightforward. So having that experience as an editor has really helped me as a writer as well, kind of going into it, not gaming the system. I can't say we can ever game the system, but at least understanding the system a lot more, whether it's in the academic world or in the literary and artistic world as well. So my takeaway, and if you can take this with a grain of salt, is that volunteer to be an editor. It's a really, really good experience because it gives you that other perspective as well. And there are a lot of other organizations including Ricepaper, that that are looking for editors as well. And you can volunteer or work part-time as well, editing. I'm not talking about an editor where somebody hires you and you just sort of do the grammar and stylistic things like that, but actually going into a publication and actually seeing the whole workflow and the process and editing pieces. It will give you a whole new perspective into what it is to be an editor. And then you can, once you are doing your writing, you kind of can really understand both sides.
Thanks. So we have a question from Sachi, who asks, what about writing blogs on the Medium? So which is the platform for self-publishing articles and blogs? Is it good to show that you have published articles when you're pitching to publishers on a blog, for example, or on these kind of applications?
I think it's a great idea. I mean, it's just another way of practicing your writing, right? You're writing on a blog, you're writing an article, you're getting an idea across, right, to an audience. I'm not sure if Medium offers, does it offer editing? I don't know much about Medium. Or do you just self-publish? You just put whatever you want? Okay.
Mm-hmm. I think it is. I think you publish it as is. Mm-hmm.
Okay, then, you know, I'm guessing that once you publish like a couple of them, like over time, you're gonna get better and better and better, right? It's inevitable, and I think, you know, it's just another way of practicing your writing.
Really great question. I think academics have really caught on to this, and almost every single professor or instructor or PhD student, or even now master students, will have some sort of online profile, and they kind of put sort of parts of the research on a blog. It's been done for a long time from the academics, but even in Asia, microfiction, microblogs have been really popular. Jeannie, there's a better term for it. I wonder if, I can't quite recall what it is, but novels have been written from blogs, and it's sort of serialized, and they have been bought by publishers and the stories and put into a novel form, but all started from their blogs, this microblogs. So it's been done in other countries throughout the world. It's nothing new, and in the Western world, I think we're kind of catching it on late in terms of really taking it seriously. I think a lot of people have their own blogs, but they use it for other reasons, other than actually putting their writing together and start formulating something really neat. Of course, there's copyright. You know, a lot of people will be worried about copyright, but we can have another workshop on that. We won't worry about that in this workshop. But having something online as a blog is a really not only powerful way to encourage you and motivate you to write, but also creating that writer's profile is really important.
Okay, so we only have 2 minutes left, so we can't answer too many more questions, only maybe just 1 or 2, 3 more, and then that's it. So just these 2 questions. What makes a good editor? I think we kind of touched on it a bit earlier, but also, can you accept work from abroad?
For accept work from abroad for Ricepaper magazine? Is that the question?
I assume yes, for Ricepaper.
Okay. I can quickly answer this question, and Jeannie, feel free to jump in. Really great question to end the day. Answer is yes. Ricepaper has really expanded its coverage and focus to beyond Canadians of Asian descent to really the Asian diaspora. We're really trying to push for a new generation of writers. And you know, a lot of times as writers, you're informed by your experiences. So even if you're Asian Canadian, you're here in Canada, but your experiences are informed by places that you lived in and countries that you've been in. So it's a transnational sort of world that we're in right now. It's not, citizenship isn't the only thing that determines where you can submit your work to. So I think that sort of answers what I think about accepting submissions from abroad. Jeannie?
Yeah, I mean, we do. I think previously we were tied to grant restrictions. It has to be Canadian, But I think now we're freer because we're an online publication. So yeah, we will accept online pieces from anywhere in the world. So.
Okay, well, thank you both. I'm sorry we're out of time, but thanks you all for tuning in for the LiterASIAN Festival, and I hope you enjoyed our program. Please join us again for more upcoming events at LiterASIAN Festival at our www.literasian.com for more news and events to come. Thanks. See ya.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
All right, take care. Have a good weekend.